Hey, morning all. Welcome to the last lecture. So this morning we're going to be looking at existential. Sorry, it will be handed out. Did somebody get one who shouldn't have? Comes the issue. Okay. So we're going to have a quick overview and look at existential therapy. As this wasn't part of one of the core questions, I left it towards the end because we wouldn't cover it in the seminar. But it's one of the major approaches used in counseling, particularly in private practice, and in certain organizations where it would be more appropriate to utilize. So there's a lot of information in these slides. Some of them I'll go through fairly quickly, others I will do a little more detail on. Okay. So I was going to play you Pink Floyd, but it takes a bit too long time. So think about the words that the Pink Floyd song gives you. Ticking away the moments that make up the dull day. You fritter and waste the hours in an offhand way. Kicking around on a piece of ground in your hometown, waiting for someone or something to show you the way. Tired of lying in the sunshine, staying at home to watch the rain? You're young and life is long, there's time to kill today. And then one day, you find that 10 years have got behind you. No one told you when to run. You missed the starting gun. You run and run to catch up with the sun, but it's sinking, racing around to come up behind you again. The sun is the same in a relative way, but you're older, shorter of breath, one day closer to death. Every year is getting shorter, never seem to find the time. Plans that either come to naught or half a page of scribbled lines, hanging on in a quiet desperation in the English way. The time is gone, the song is over. Thought I'd something more to say. Home, home again, I'd like to be here when I can. When I come home cold and tired, it's good to warm my bones beside the fire. Far away across the field, the tolling of the iron bell calls the faithful to their meals, to hear the softly spoken magic spell. The words to the Pink Floyd song, Time. What's that song about? Life. Life and death. The cycle of life and death. The cycle of life and choices. The cycle of life and meaning. The pointlessness of it, yeah? Yeah? The whole range of elements that is in there. So there's some core ideas around existentialism. Now, existentialism really emerged in the late 50s, the hippie era of the 60s, from way of putting it. The zeitgeist of the time, from Jean-Paul Sartre, man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Such is the first principle of existentialism. So there were a whole number of key thinkers. Augustine, Pascal, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. Okay, if you try and read Nietzsche, it will explode your mind. They are difficult readings, but they are challenging. And these were people who began the postmodern approaches. They began to look at that whole idea that there is no such thing as truth. Truth is relative. And hence, the whole approach to life suddenly shifted as well. And they began to then focus on the questions of existence. And a whole number of psychologists began to focus on the questions of existence. And mainly from the States, you have Rollo May, Ernest Angel, and Ellingenberger, and Yalom has been the dominant writers around existential psychotherapy. What does it mean to be in your life? What's the meaning of your life? Yalom is the most influential writer around existentialism at the moment. He has a lovely little book called The Gift of Therapy. Lovely little book to read, nice one just to read on the tube if you've got a moment. You can get it as an e-book, read it on your phone. They're short little 100-word chapters type idea around experiences of doing therapy and the gift that therapy gives both to the client and to the therapist. So Rolles-May comes from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Bergenthal's Search for Existential Identity, and Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning was very influential. Viktor Frankl survived the concentration camps. He was a psychiatrist, and he began to think, why did some people survive and others not? And it's those who had greater meaning, a greater purpose. They saw something more that gave them a reason to live. And so he explored that. The main element around existential therapy is it's a philosophy, not a therapeutic approach necessarily. You'll struggle to find any particular techniques, orientations, ideas of what you should do. But it's an approach to the person and the therapeutic environment. So it's broadly philosophical about human nature. And it's this presupposition that they hold that underlies the therapy. How they think about human nature is what determines how they engage with the client. And so that's going to depend upon which philosophical tradition you're coming. Are you following Sartre, or Kierkegaard, or Heidegger? So if any of you have ever done philosophy, you don't know who these philosophers are. These are major modern day, late century philosophers. Lots changed since as well. Philosophy is actually a very strong academic subject still. And a very important subject. And something to consider studying. Because knowing how you think and what basis your knowledge comes from is a very important element. And something I've always wanted is, what is the philosophical basis of counseling? Nobody's actually done a research project on that I'm aware of. I haven't been able to find a clear book or idea on the philosophical underpinnings of counseling and psychotherapy. But they're all there. I haven't had a lot of time to pull it together, but it's an idea of a research project. It's something you look at in your dissertation. Not an unfeasible one. You'd have to know your stuff to be able to write that one. So, from a philosophical point of view, the conflicts that individuals are experiencing in therapy are the givens of existence, is how they refer to them as. Okay? So there's certain givens of existence. And they look at this deep conflict as the most fundamental concern that the client has. Okay? And we'll come to the givens of existence in a moment. So these are some of the most important people we've touched on. Okay. Viktor Frankl, Rolles-May, and Irvin Yalom. So Viktor Frankl's existential therapy is otherwise known as logotherapy, if you're thinking of that previously. Man's Search for Meaning. Rolles-May, he's drawn from existential philosophy, and he began to draw the existential into psychotherapy for the first time. And I remember trying to read Rolles-May's Man's Search for himself when I was 16. My brother was doing psychology at university, and he brought it home as one of his textbooks. And I tried to read it, and I just didn't follow it. It was not easy, but at 16 I didn't have the underpinnings or whatever. But it started my interest. There I knew I wanted to be a psychologist. That was what started. So by the time I finished school, I'd read the whole of first year psychology. Because my brother had left his books at home, and I read them all. So Yalom, he takes the existential elements and applies them to psychodynamics theory. He adds them into psychodynamic, into Freudian. He combines existentialism and psychodynamic. And that's what makes his therapy so powerful. And he looks at death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness as the core topics that clients are sitting with. So whatever the client presents with, he begins to look at them in terms of these broad categories. Where would he place them? Are they dealing with issues of life and death, freedom and responsibility, isolation versus connection, meaning or meaninglessness in their life? There's a nice YouTube video of an interview with him. You can watch that later. Click on that link and it will take you there. So, 4 main components that he's looking at around what are the key components. So what are the key elements that existentialism and the existentialists would fall in the broad school of humanistic. Okay, so remember that. They're falling under the umbrella the humanistics. They're not psychodynamic. They're not behaviorists. They're falling under the school of the humanistics together with Rogers, Maslow, Pearls. Okay, so the existentialists are part of the humanistic tradition. It's not a specific technique. It focuses on the central issues of existence. I really need to edit the slides. Saying the same thing over and over. So what they're looking at within this, the personal relationship between client and therapist is the key focus. A very Rogerian, looking at helping people make choice, personal freedom, helping clients to make choices. And sometimes they're not necessarily pretty choices, but you do have a choice. You're dying. Are you going kicking and screaming? Or are you accepting it and embracing that stage of life, to die? Because that's how the existentialist will see death. It's a stage of living. You know, you embrace death. It's the next stage of your life, is to die. Because we all die. As the old saying goes, we know what's for certain: change, death, and taxes. Those are the definites of life, people. Things will always change. We will all die one day, and there will always be taxes. So it places a big value on self-awareness of the client. It's trying to develop a sense of self-awareness. So their view of human nature, they have 6 existential propositions in total. A capacity for self-awareness, a tension between freedom and responsibility, an idea of creating identity and having a meaningful relationship. That there is a search for meaning, purpose, value, and goals in life. That anxiety is a condition of living. It's normal to be anxious. And that we have an awareness of death and non-being. And you can see the bit of the Freudian influence there, in that sense of the life force and the death force. You know. So that's a nice mind map of thinking about the existentialists and how they're breaking down what they're dealing with in each of their major areas. So we're going to cover each of these in a little more detail. The capacity for self-awareness. This is the key element in helping clients to become self-aware and to develop their sense that they have a choice, and to act or not to act is the choice, and not acting is a choice. Okay. We don't automatically generate meaning. We must seek it. We might think meaning exists, but we actually are culturally framed within certain meaning frameworks, and so here as we know the meaning of things, but it's actually we've been taught it. We have to find the meaning of life for ourselves. We all know what the meaning of life is. 42. Sorry. Yeah. Cultural reference. Monty Python's meaning of life. The end of the Monty Python's meaning of life. What is the meaning of life? 42. That's crazy Monty Python humor for you. Just the age of where they were all at when they made the Monty Python meaning of life skit. So, what we realize in our choice is time is limited. We have to choose. We have to seek meaning. And we are subject to loneliness, meaninglessness, emptiness, guilt, and isolation if we don't. So, is that client who's suffering from depression actually not suffering from an existential crisis? Does he need medication? Or does he need to make a few choices about his life? I saw a young client. He was in his late 20s, came to see me for depression. But effectively, he was sitting with not having made a choice. He was too scared to act in order to live. And he was trapped in his room playing computer games because that became his new existence. He could make choices in the games, but he couldn't make choices about his life. And despite trying to use the game's analogies, it was just too scary a prospect for him to the idea that life exists outside the window. That you're going to live it, not pretend it. He never came back. Just too scary. He made that one forage out, and that was too scary. Yeah, he made a choice not to live. He made a choice not to live. So that is, the central issue is freedom and responsibility. Okay? The ultimate idea, freedom assumes responsibility. Okay? When you have the freedom to choose, you have the responsibility of making that choice. Or not acting. As well. We are authors of our own world. Okay? And there's a bridge between wishing and action is the decision-making process. So you can see a lot of pragmatic kind of work might come into play with existentialism. There might be a lot of simple problem solving with clients. What is the decision you have to make? So they're very eclectic in their techniques and their approaches. They will use whatever will help them address the core issues. So with each of these are the concepts they use. There's no particular technique. These are the ideas that they're addressing. Self-awareness, freedom and responsibility. Okay? So we are free to choose, but we need to recognize our failure to take action. And what happens is we tend to blame others. By not taking action, we tend to place the responsibility on another person. It's their fault. It's their fault I'm like this. And leave yourself in the victim passive position. So you have to encourage them to consider and explore with them the alternative options that they're faced with. So it's a lot of exploration. It's a journey you're doing with them, trying to make sense and meaning of their life. We cannot escape freedom and responsibility. With freedom comes responsibility. If we want to experience more freedom in the life, you must take more responsibility for your choices. And that's how they see the combination. Okay? If you want more freedom, you must take more responsibility. So if you want to live in an open, egalitarian society, you have greater freedom, but with that comes responsibility for making your choices. Simple things from what you have for breakfast to the clothes you wear, of how you get to work, what you believe, are all greater freedoms. So in Western Europe in particular, the Western world, we have a lot of freedom of choice, freedom of religion, freedom of choice of sexual orientation. all the protected characteristics under the Equality Act are freedoms of choice in many ways. You know, but with that, you have to take the responsibility of making choice. Or you can choose to live in a very narrow society where choice is made for you. You will wear this. You will think like this. You will behave in these ways. Maoist China, Communist Russia, fundamentalist religions. Take away freedom and take away choice. So you have less responsibility. But even within that, you still have choice and responsibility to choose how you will go and how you will live. Okay? So, the concept of bad faith refers to an inauthentic existence. That's what they talk about. That you're not living in a congruent manner. You're living in bad faith. Now, this is the kind of blame game that clients will use. I'm like this because I grew up in the alcoholic family. I can't help myself because I was a victim of X, Y, Z. Child abuse, neglect, abandonment, a war, a tsunami. Okay? So when you're blaming, and the difference is one is a reason, the other is an excuse. I'm like this because I grew up in a series of foster homes. That's a reason. But I can't do anything different. Using that reason is an excuse. You always have choice coming out of those. Is the way they see it. Okay? And if you don't accept that you still have choice, yes, bad things have happened to you. Horrible. Not great. Limits your choice maybe. Hasn't given you the opportunities that others have had. But if you sit there blaming, that's bad faith. You're not engaging with living your life. You're inauthentic. So the third element is about creating identity and establishing meaningful relationships. So who are you? Becomes the question. A fundamental philosophical question. Who am I? That angst we all experience in our mid-teenage years. The sense of who am I? What do I want to be? Where am I going? What's my life about? Why was I born? I remember those angst times. Okay? Do I fit in? Am I going to be different? Do I belong? Don't I belong? It's the courage to be. Okay? And we need to find our own fear, trust ourselves to find within and find our own answers. Our greatest fear is that we'll discover we've got no real sense of self. And it's about challenging clients who have lost their touch with their identity and letting others to design their life. So it's dealing with a lot of clients. Existentialism deals well with people who are passive victims in their life, who are passengers, living off the coattails of other people's decisions, where they haven't really, they've just gone along with the crowd, and somehow can't quite figure out why they've ended up in the position they have, because they've never actually taken choice to live who they are. And that's part of what you guys have all done. You've made a choice to develop an identity that involves being, part of that identity involves being a counselor or a person who helps others, who wants to help others. You've made a choice. And that might well be going against what others might have thought you should do or not do. And it might well challenge those around you and create tension in your lives. Taking up study as a mature adult challenges everybody else around you. Choosing to leave a relationship will challenge those around you to be authentic and make a choice. When I chose to leave my first wife, just based on a number of elements, but one of those was I found the courage to be myself. to be true more fully to myself than living on what people had expected of this relationship to be. We'd been living together 10 years and we got married. Everybody thought, oh, that's it, baby, together forever. And all of that family pressures, I went on what others wanted rather than what I wanted. And out of fear of not wanting to be alone, I had engaged in a relationship that actually wasn't good for me, nor for my partner, actually, in the long run. But when I made the choice to leave, it had major ramifications. I didn't like it. Because from the outside, I had an apparent happy marriage. And so I challenged everybody else's beliefs about their marriages when I left. And that's the impact of making choices to be authentic. So think about those. So we are all alone, people, whether we like it or not. At the coalface of your life, you are alone. You have to make that decision. No one can make it for you. You have to take the action. No one will take the action for you. So at the very edge of your life, even when you're in a deep committed relationship, you are alone. In philosophical existential terms. You live life fully. But we need to create connection. And so a lot of the focus in working with clients is how do they avoid connection? Are they just embracing their aloneness or not? It's easy to live alone. No demands. Do what you want. Don't have to be accountable. No. And it's a choice. But you lose out in the richness of what connection brings. The experience of relatedness is seen as vital because we are social beings. And being social beings is what keeps society going and together. If we all lived alone, we'd crumble as a society very quickly. The sense of cohesion that exists would fall apart. And so for a lot of therapy, the existentialists see that just being in therapy and helping a client connect, even though it's a therapeutic connection, is healing. It's very Rogerian. And I had an experience of this with a client who I saw for nearly 3 years. For every week that she came, I wondered why she was there. She had no obvious issues. Yet she came for 3 years religiously every week for therapy. And only over time that I began to realize she didn't know how to relate. She could present on a very surface level and do the appropriate social sorts of things, but actually beyond that, there was no depth to her. She was like a sheet of paper. She didn't know how to show her true self to anybody. You know, she was in her late 20s when she started going into her 30s. She had never been in a relationship. She was still a virgin. And she was frightened of connection. She didn't know how to connect. So therapy became a training ground of connection. Today, she's happily married. Because she learned connection and was able to begin tentatively testing it out in the real world. And getting it wrong and bringing that back. And it was about being related to by another human being in a human being manner. Gave her more meaning. The only thing she had a connection with prior to that was her horse. She used to be a horse rider. And that was her strongest bond that she had had. You're able to draw on that. Quote from John Lennon. When I was 5 years old, my mother always told me that happiness was the key to life. When I went to school, they asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I wrote down happy. They told me I didn't understand the assignment. I told them they didn't understand life. We missed John. So part of that is the search for meaning, the purpose of life. Why are we here? What gives your life purpose? What gives your life meaning? What do you want from life? What is the source of meaning in your life at the moment? And that will change as your life evolves. There might be an overall fundamental guiding idea, principle, process, but at the end of the day, that will keep changing. So it's about asking, if you had to have a motto that gives your life meaning, what would it be? If you had to write down a motto or a name of the book that would describe the meaning of your life, what would that title be? Mine is Make a Difference. But live life to the full. Don't miss out on opportunities. Live life to the full, people, because you don't know what tomorrow brings. But in your process of living, make a difference. Those are my philosophical pins. I like to make a difference. I live my life to the full. So I'll try new things all the time. I'll take risks. I'll do experiments. I'll try anything once. So I've done most things. I've jumped out of airplanes, climbed up mountains, whitewater canoed, walked in the wild, done survival courses, been on retreats, taken part in religious group ceremonies, smoked cannabis. Hooray. Experience life, people. But make choices in that journey. Some things you might know. You don't like apple pie. But the idea is that meaninglessness leads to emptiness, which leads to a sense of hollowness, and so people get depressed. People get vague. People get no sense of purpose. You see it on the tube, of people going to work to meaningless jobs. There's a hollowness in their eyes. There's no life there. You see the people in jobs where they're stuck in a dead end, meaningless job, they're shuffling paper. The epitome for me is call centers. No. Take a risk. Get on a bicycle and cycle around the world. Why not? Gives your life more meaning, personally. So finding meaning is the byproduct of engaging in living. You achieve meaning by living. You don't get meaning and then live. It's by doing you get a sense of purpose and meaning. You can't just find meaning out of nothing. You have to engage in order to find meaning. And part of that journey is anxiety is a condition of living. Okay? Anxiety is about the threat to our existence. We have an underlying sense of mortality, that there are threats to us, and that's an instinctive process. It's normal. If the situation is confronted and it generates a level of anxiety, that is normal. If I had to ask one of you to come up here and finish the lecture, what would that do? Yeah. There would be a high level of anxiety would be appropriate. Same with you, all of you when you come to present in the PPD module. You all have to do presentations to your class. It's going to generate anxiety. Normal, appropriate. That's part of living. Okay? In contrast to normal anxiety, neurotic anxiety is repressed unconscious impulses. So, what they're looking at is the normal anxiety of living, not the deeper unconscious anxiety of Freud. They're looking at what is normal. But what are the normals that generate anxiety are the four givens. The four givens of death, freedom, existential isolation, and meaninglessness. These are the elements that generate anxiety. The anxiety can be a stimulus for growth if we come to accept our freedom of choice in these areas and to make choice. So Rollo sees freedom and anxiety are two sides of the same coin. You can't make choice without some level of anxiety being present. Do I do this or do I do that? Do I choose CBT or do I choose integrative? There's a level of anxiety there, people. It's life. Am I making the right decision? Am I making the wrong decision? We'll deal with that in the seminar. It's not to eliminate anxiety, but to help them overcome their defenses and choose to live in face of the fear. Okay? The fourth one is death and dying. Death gives significance to living. If I had to tell you, you all had 48 hours in which to live, because at the end of this I will execute you all, suddenly gives meaning to life. Or if you've been diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, cancer, heart attack, or a loved one has died, suddenly life becomes very richer, vibrant, and alive. Okay? So if you had 30 days left to live, what would you do? How would you feel? What would it do? Yeah. Idea of bucket lists. That's where it came from. Bucket list is an existential crisis. And there are certain points where we have these existential crises that are seen as quite normal as well. So teenage years, who am I? Early adulthood, am I ever going to find somebody to love me? In your 30s, am I ever going to get my career off my ground? In your 40s, have I been successful? In your 50s and going into your 60s, was my life meaningful or meaningless? Are all major existential points. That's why you have the midlife crisis and the man puts the wife out and buys a sports car and marries a 20-year-old. It's an existential crisis, people. Mario! So it's about being aware that we will die, will give meaning to living. Okay? And it's all about the ontology of being. I'm not even going to go into that in detail. The I am experience. Okay? What you live. I want to move on because we're running out of a bit of time to the therapeutic existential therapy. So given that these are the four elements, death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness, therapy faces or challenges these elements. That we have to face this obvious truth and the conflict between death and dying, and death and living. Okay? And they see psychopathology is failure to deal with the inevitability of death. I think it's a bit rich, a bit strong to put all psychopathology around that, but that's one of their key elements. But it is a terrible truth. We will all die one day, as much as we don't want to face it, and the way our society has sanitized death. Compared to the Victorian era, where death was omnipresent. It was richly embraced. The person would be put in the front room, and everyone would come and pay their respects. The Irish wake. Now, death is sanitized, but sex is everywhere. Whereas in the Victorian era, sex was absolutely taboo. Heaven forbid I showed an ankle. Now you can barely get people to cover up. Yeah, things change. And it's important about looking at where is death today and how can we make it part of living rather than sanitizing it into hospitals and funeral homes. So freedom forces people to look at responsibility and decision-making processes. Isolation is two levels, interpersonal and intrapersonal. So they've broken it down. They're drawing on the psychodynamic elements and look at intrapersonal isolation. How do we split stuff off from ourselves? How do we deny our blind spots? We don't want to see that we've got these elements of ourselves that are not good. The sense of how do they find meaning in a universe that has no meaning? In our consumer society, how do you find meaning? As the Mick Jagger song goes, I can get no satisfaction. My shirts are not as white as they should be because I'm not using the right brand of washing powder. That's what that song's essentially about. Yeah. How do you get satisfaction in a consumer society where you are labeled good or bad by literally the label you wear? Is it Gucci or not? And there's a counter reaction to this. There's a big anti-consumerism movement out there now where people are going, I don't want stuff. Why do I need all this stuff? What do I need to live? And they're getting rid of stuff. And they're downsizing into minimalist living arrangements and recycling and redoing, reusing stuff. I think it's a good thing personally. So the therapeutic goals of the existential therapy is to expand the client's self-awareness, highlight their potential choices, help the client accept responsibility for their choice, and get them to experience an authentic existence. So that's taking the four givens and making them goals. So that's what therapy becomes. The clients have choices. They're not necessarily always pretty choices. As Viktor Frankl said, you could either walk into the gas chamber singing, or you can be pulled in kicking and screaming. That's your choice. You had no choice. You were going to die that day. You were being put in the gas chamber. Did you walk in singing your song? Or did you fight? Or did you just go in passively like sheep and did nothing? There's a choice even in death. So the therapist's role and function is to understand the client's subjective world, help them take that responsibility, and to help them break the blaming process. So existential therapy works very well with clients who have particular conditions. So it works well with clients who are struggling with developmental crises, identity crisis in adolescence, coping with disappointments in both family and career, and they don't achieve the goal that they thought they were going to achieve. Grief counseling in particular is very good with this. Coping with physical limitations as one ages, in particular, or if a disability happens, how do you deal with those sorts of elements? Surprisingly, dealing with low self-confidence and senses of inadequacy, stress, tension, and social anxiety. These are well-documented areas where existential therapy has been successful in working with the client. And so from a multicultural perspective, the social and cultural factors play a very important role in what defines and gives meaning. So living a good, honorable, caregiving, helping of others in life, if you have a Christian style orientation, would filter that. But if you've grown up in an atheistic, materialistic consumer home, then having the biggest house with the sports car and having £1 million in the bank is equally giving that kind meaning. Because it all is relative. There's no absolute meaning out there, people. You find your meaning in your context, in your cultural environment. You help them look at those limitations as well. And some cultures don't allow the talk of self-determination and sense of self because they're dominant a we culture. The group is more important than the individual. So existentialism is very Western, philosophically based. So you need to remember that. It's a Western existentialism, not a world existentialism. So they base the idea of being an individual, living your authentic existence on what you need. Fragments the group. Unless you're joining as part of the group and taking on that group's meaning and identity and process. So multiculturally, it will clash with those where the group focus, the family, everything is kept within the family, is more important than what the individual needs. So it's not a neutral therapeutic approach. So it has something to offer most counselors in terms of self-determination, help clients accept responsibility, looks at and making sense of anxiety, guilt, death, being alone, and helping clients to choose for themselves. Okay? However, it lacks a systemic statement of principles or practices. It uses very vague and global terms. There hasn't been a lot of research. What there is limited. Limited for often your lower functioning level clients who are very concrete, who can't think in those sort of existential terms. It's quite a philosophical based way of thinking. So if a client isn't reflective, you're going to be pretty stuck. It doesn't work with clients who are in extreme crisis, who need direction, support, and holding. It's a little too vague. I'm about to be made homeless is a crisis that existentialism can't sort of process for the next 6 months when you're about to be on the street in 2 weeks' time. Yeah? And it's a very verbal, intellectual head process. It doesn't deal very powerfully with emotions. We'll touch on them and deal with them, but it's an intellectual debate. And if you ever go to an existential therapy support professional meeting, you'll see who take on existential therapy. There is the Society of Existential Analysis, otherwise known as C. I think they're all at C. And if you have not met Henri, I will introduce you to Henri.